Imagine yourself surrounded by thousands of soldiers. The deafening sound of trumpets echoes through the valleys, while an immortal leader of Roman history commands his legions in a battle that would define the fate of all Gaul. We are in the year 52 before Christ, and the Battle of Alesia is about to change the course of history. Julius Caesar, the relentless strategist, against Vercingetorix, the Gallic warrior who dared to challenge the power of Rome. Picture this scene. The autumn air filled with tension, the gleaming armor of Roman legionaries contrasting with the fierce tribal warriors of Gaul. Two worlds colliding in what would become one of the most significant sieges in ancient warfare. The fate of an entire civilization hanging in the balance as two brilliant commanders face off in a deadly game of strategy. What happened in this epic confrontation? How did Caesar, with a smaller army, achieve such a decisive victory? The answer lies in a perfect storm of military genius, desperate courage, and innovative siege tactics that would be studied for thousands of years to come. Did you know that Caesar's army was actually outnumbered nearly 3-1? While commanding approximately 40,000 men, he found himself facing not only the 80,000 Gauls inside Alesia, but also a relief force of over 100,000 warriors coming to break the siege. The odds seemed impossible, yet Caesar's response was nothing short of revolutionary. In the shadow of this ancient hill fort, Caesar would execute one of the most daring military maneuvers in history, building not one, but two massive rings of fortifications. The inner ring to keep Vercingetorix trapped inside Alesia, and the outer ring to protect his own forces from the incoming Gallic reinforcements. Imagine building 21 miles of walls, towers, and deadly traps while surrounded by enemies on both sides. Discover now the secrets of this historic battle and understand how its repercussions resonate to this day. The conquest of Gaul would permanently alter European history, spreading Roman language, law, and culture throughout Western Europe. The foundations of modern France, and indeed much of Western civilization, were laid in the aftermath of this pivotal moment. If you love discovering secrets from the past that changed the world, leave your like and subscribe to the Legacy of Empires channel. The history I'm going to tell today influences our lives to this day. Prepare yourself for an epic journey through history. Activate the bell to not miss any battle, empire, or mystery of ancient civilizations. The battlefield that would witness this clash of civilizations was the mighty fortress of Alesia, perched high upon a hill in what is now central France. This wasn't just any settlement, it was a natural fortress surrounded by rivers on two sides and rugged, challenging terrain that made any approach a perilous endeavor. For the Gauls, it seemed like the perfect defensive position, almost impenetrable to enemy forces. When archaeologists began excavating this historic site in the 19th century, what they discovered left them in awe. The remnants of Caesar's engineering prowess were still visible after 2,000 years. Can you imagine the scale of what Caesar built? His men constructed an inner ring of fortifications stretching 11 miles around the entire hill fort, wooden palisades standing 12 feet high with watchtowers positioned every 130 feet. But that's not all. What made Caesar's strategy truly revolutionary were the deadly obstacles he placed before these walls. His engineers dug a network of ditches, some filled with water, others concealing sharpened stakes that the Romans called lilies because of their flower-like arrangement. They buried thousands of foot-piercing stimuli, iron barbs hidden in the ground, and created branches sharpened to points known as tombstones. This ancient minefield was designed to break any charge before it reached the Roman lines. The most fascinating discovery came in the 1860s, when Emperor Napoleon III ordered extensive excavations at the site. Archaeologists uncovered the exact spot where Caesar built his famous double wall, confirmation of the incredible account he wrote in his memoirs. The evidence was right there in the soil, the remains of trenches, post holes for the wooden palisades, and even some of the iron weapons used in the battle. Inside Alesia, the atmosphere grew increasingly desperate as the siege tightened. Hunger gnawed at the bellies of warriors and civilians alike. Fear and uncertainty spread through the crowded streets as food reserves dwindled. Did you know that Vercingetorix eventually made the heartbreaking decision to expel women and children from the fortress to conserve food, but Caesar refused to let them pass through his lines? These civilians were trapped in no man's land, starving between the two armies, a brutal reality of ancient warfare. Meanwhile, on the Roman side, every legionary understood what was at stake. These professional soldiers, many veterans of years of campaigning in Gaul, knew that victory here would mean the final subjugation of a land they had fought over for 8 long years. Each man who stood guard on those walls realized he was participating in a moment that would echo through the centuries. The tension in the air was as thick as the morning fog that rolled over the hills of ancient Gaul. At the heart of this monumental clash stood 2 extraordinary men whose names would be forever etched in history. Julius Caesar wasn't merely a military commander. He was the embodiment of Roman ambition and cunning. By the time he reached Alesia, Caesar was 48 years old, battle-hardened and hungry for the glory that would propel him to power in Rome. What many don't realize is that while directing this massive siege, Caesar was simultaneously writing detailed accounts of his campaigns that would serve as masterful propaganda back in Rome. Every victory wasn't just military, it was political capital. Caesar's mind was like a chess master's, always thinking several moves ahead. Did you know that before becoming a military leader, he had been a priest, a lawyer, and a politician? This diverse background gave him insights that purely military men lacked. He understood that conquering Gaul wasn't just about defeating armies. It was about breaking their spirit and presenting himself as the only man capable of leading Rome into a new age. Standing against this Roman juggernaut was Vercingetorix, whose name in Gaulish meant king of great warriors, and he certainly lived up to it. Unlike Caesar, who inherited a world-class military machine, Vercingetorix performed the near impossible. He united dozens of notoriously independent Gallic tribes that had been fighting each other for centuries. Imagine convincing bitter rivals with ancient blood feuds to suddenly fight side by side. This charismatic young chieftain, only about 30 years old at the time, accomplished what no Gaul had done before. What makes Vercingetorix's achievement even more remarkable is that he had to convince his people to adopt a scorched earth strategy, burning their own fields and villages to deny resources to the Romans. This painful sacrifice demonstrated his extraordinary leadership. There's a fascinating story that when one tribe hesitated to join his alliance, Vercingetorix didn't threaten violence. Instead, he executed the ambassadors of tribes that had already joined him to prove his commitment and seriousness. His methods were harsh, but they united Gaul when unity was its only hope. The confrontation between these 2 brilliant minds created a deadly game of strategy. While Caesar relied on discipline, engineering, and the professional training of his legions, Vercingetorix countered with superior knowledge of the terrain, overwhelming numbers, and the desperate courage of men fighting for their homeland and way of life. In many ways, this wasn't just a battle between armies, it was a clash between 2 visions of the future. Caesar's dream of a unified empire under Roman law and civilization, against Vercingetorix's struggle to preserve the independence and ancient traditions of the Celtic world. These men were fighting not just for victory in battle, but for which world would shape the future of Europe. The Siege of Alesia stands as a masterpiece of military engineering that continues to astonish historians and strategists to this day. What Caesar accomplished was nothing short of revolutionary. He essentially built a city to capture a city. When his forces arrived at Alesia and found Vercingetorix's army sheltered within its walls, Caesar made an audacious decision that defied conventional warfare tactics of the ancient world. Instead of simply surrounding the fortress, Caesar ordered his legions to construct not one, but two massive rings of fortifications. The inner ring, stretching 13 miles in circumference, was designed to keep the Gauls trapped inside Alesia. But Caesar's genius revealed itself in the outer ring, an additional 11 miles of walls facing outward, designed to protect his own army from the massive Gallic relief force he knew would arrive. Just imagine the scale of this project. 24,000 Roman soldiers working day and night, moving over 1 million cubic feet of earth, felling entire forests for timber, and constructing 21 miles of sophisticated defensive works in just 3 weeks. Each legionary dug, built, and fortified as if Rome's future depended on it, because it did. These weren't simple walls either. The Roman fortifications included a complex system of defenses that would make even modern military engineers nod in appreciation. There were 8-foot-deep ditches filled with water diverted from nearby rivers. Behind these moats stood ramparts, topped with palisades and defensive towers every 130 feet. Between the ditches and walls, Caesar's men planted what they called lilies, hidden pits containing sharpened stakes positioned at an angle to impale charging warriors. They scattered iron stimuli, caltrops that would pierce the feet of anyone unfortunate enough to step on them. The ground became a deadly obstacle course designed to break any attack before it reached the Roman lines. When the massive Gallic relief army of over 100,000 warriors finally arrived, the stage was set for one of history's most dramatic battles. The Romans found themselves in a nightmarish scenario, attacked from the outside by fresh troops while simultaneously having to prevent breakout attempts from the starving forces within Alesia. For days, desperate battles raged along the outer fortifications. At times, the Gallic forces nearly breached the Roman defenses. There's an incredible moment described in Caesar's own accounts when Gallic warriors filled one of the defensive ditches with bundles of sticks and earth to create a crossing point. The situation became so dire that Caesar himself donned his distinctive scarlet cloak, the sign to his men that their general had entered the fight personally. In what would become the decisive moment of the entire Gallic wars, Caesar gathered his cavalry and led a charge against the Gauls from a hidden position. Picture this dramatic scene: Caesar's German and Roman horsemen smashing into the flank of the Gallic army while their attention was fixed on the Roman fortifications. The psychological impact was devastating. The sight of Caesar's red cloak leading the charge spread panic through the Gallic ranks. What had seemed like an almost certain Gallic victory suddenly collapsed into chaos and retreat. Within Alesia, Vercingetorix watched as his last hope of relief disintegrated on the plains below the fortress. After holding out with remarkable determination, he faced the grim reality that his cause was lost. The final act of this drama would see him surrender personally to Caesar in a gesture that would be immortalized in art and literature for thousands of years to come. What would your strategy have been if you were a leader in this situation? Pause the video and leave your theory in the comments. How about a historical challenge? Leave your like on the video and subscribe to the Legacy of Empires channel. Gaul was far more than just a battlefield. It was a land steeped in ancient myths and spiritual traditions that stretched back countless generations. When Romans and Gauls clashed at Alesia, they brought with them not just weapons and tactics, but entire worldviews that stood in stark contrast to one another. At the heart of Gallic society were the Druids, mysterious figures who served as priests, judges, healers, and keepers of sacred knowledge. These learned men and women held tremendous power, spending up to 20 years memorizing vast collections of poems, laws, and religious texts that were never written down. Can you imagine dedicating 2 decades of your life to memorizing your people's entire cultural heritage? The Druids understood that what hung in the balance at Alesia wasn't merely political control, but the survival of their entire way of life. According to ancient accounts, the Druids performed rituals in sacred groves and believed that certain trees, particularly the oak, contained powerful spirits. They practiced divination by examining the entrails of sacrificed animals and the patterns of birds in flight. As the Battle of Alesia approached, these spiritual leaders would have conducted elaborate ceremonies, seeking guidance from their gods and ancestors. They likely viewed the conflict through a mythic lens, as a struggle between their sacred traditions and Roman materialism. What's particularly fascinating is that the site of Alesia itself may have held religious significance. Archaeological evidence suggests it was not just a fortress, but a center for trade and religious ceremonies. The name Alesia might even derive from Alison, a Celtic goddess of protection. Imagine the psychological impact on the Gallic warriors, fighting not just for their lives and freedom, but for a sacred place central to their identity. For the Gauls, war was intertwined with their spiritual beliefs. Warriors often went into battle adorned with symbols of divine protection, spirals, triskells, and animal totems. Some Gallic tribes practiced a form of ritual nudity in battle, believing it demonstrated their courage to the gods and terrified their enemies. Though at Alesia they fought fully armored, many warriors likely carried talismans and had sworn sacred oaths before their gods to defend their homeland. The Romans, in their pragmatic way, had their own religious practices surrounding warfare. Before each campaign, their generals would perform specific sacrifices and observe omens. Caesar himself held the position of Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, alongside his military and political roles. Every legion carried standards that weren't just military symbols, but objects of religious veneration. Soldiers would have made offerings to Mars, the god of war, and to Jupiter for victory. For Rome, conquering Gaul wasn't simply about expanding territory, it was about fulfilling what they saw as their divine mission to bring civilization to barbaric lands. The Roman concept of imperium carried both political and religious connotations of rightful rule. Each victory reinforced their belief in their cultural and spiritual superiority. As the siege of Alesia reached its climax, these two cultural worlds, one based on ancestral traditions and harmony with nature, the other on structured hierarchy and urban values, fought not just for land, but for which vision of humanity would shape the future. The Druids are said to have prophesied that defeat at Alesia would mark the end of their world, and in many ways, they were right. The fall of Vercingetorix would eventually lead to the Romanization of Gaul, with Latin replacing Celtic languages, Roman temples rising alongside sacred groves, and the gradual absorption of Gallic traditions into the vast cultural melting pot of the Roman Empire. For Caesar, victory at Alesia wasn't just military triumph, it was divine confirmation of his special destiny. He would use this success to justify his political ambitions in Rome, eventually crossing the Rubicon and transforming the Republic into an empire. In his telling of the story, the gods had favored Rome's mission of civilization over Gallic barbarism, a narrative that would echo through centuries of European colonization around the world. As the relentless siege stretched into its third week, conditions inside Alesia deteriorated from desperate to catastrophic. The stores of grain that Vercingetorix had carefully rationed were nearly exhausted. Hunger became a more fearsome enemy than the Romans themselves. Warriors who had once been fierce and proud grew gaunt, their strength fading with each passing day. The civilian population suffered even more severely. Children cried from hunger, while the elderly simply grew silent, conserving what little energy remained in their weakened bodies. It was then that Vercingetorix faced perhaps the most agonizing decision of his life. In a move that reveals the terrible calculus of ancient warfare, he ordered all non-combatants, women, children, the elderly and the infirm, to leave Alesia. He believed the Romans would allow these civilians to pass through their lines, giving them a chance at survival while extending the defenders' dwindling food supplies. But Caesar, the consummate strategist, refused to let them through. He understood that compassion in this moment would only prolong the siege and potentially cost more Roman lives. In one of history's most heartbreaking episodes, these innocent civilians found themselves trapped in no man's land, rejected by their own people, who closed Alesia's gates behind them, yet blocked by the Roman fortifications ahead. As days passed, they slowly starved to death in full view of both armies, their suffering a psychological weapon that weighed heavily on the Gallic defenders. Inside the fortress, morale plummeted. Can you imagine watching your loved ones waste away just beyond your reach? Some of Vercingetorix's subordinate chiefs began suggesting surrender, but the young leader maintained his remarkable resolve, still believing the massive relief force would break through. The relief army's arrival initially brought a surge of hope. Led by 4 powerful chieftains, including Commius of the Atrebates and Vercingetorix, Vercingetorix's cousin, this combined Gallic force launched ferocious attacks against Caesar's outer fortifications. They targeted a weak point in the Roman defences, a section where the walls crossed difficult terrain on the northwestern side of Alesia. During one particularly intense assault, Gallic warriors managed to fill in sections of the Roman ditches with dirt and bundles of sticks, then swarmed toward the walls carrying scaling ladders. Simultaneously, Vercingetorix led his starving but determined warriors out from Alesia's gates, attempting to break through the inner fortifications and join their compatriots. The Romans faced attack from both directions, a commander's worst nightmare. At certain points along the fortifications, Gallic warriors came tantalizingly close to breaking through, with small groups of men actually scaling the walls before being driven back. Did you know that during this critical phase, Caesar positioned himself at a command point where he could observe the entire battlefield? He wore his famous scarlet cloak, a garment so distinctive that both his men and his enemies could instantly recognize him from a distance. This wasn't mere vanity, it was psychological warfare. His visible presence steadied Roman resolve and struck fear into Gallic hearts. The climactic moment arrived on what would be the final day of battle. The massive Gallic relief army launched their most coordinated attack yet, with 60,000 select warriors led by Vercingetorix, assaulting a vulnerable section of the Roman lines. As the outer walls trembled under this onslaught, and Vercingetorix's forces pressed against the inner fortifications, Caesar recognized the pivotal moment had arrived. In a brilliant tactical move, Caesar dispatched his trusted lieutenant Labienus to shore up the threatened section while he personally gathered his cavalry. Leading them through a secret gate in the outer fortifications, Caesar circled behind the attacking Gauls. Imagine the shock when these warriors, fully committed to their frontal assault, suddenly saw the distinctive red cloak of Caesar himself leading a cavalry charge into their unprotected rear. The psychological impact was devastating. What had seemed like the moment of Gallic triumph instantly transformed into confusion and then panic. Caesar's cavalry smashed into the Gallic ranks while Roman infantry pressed forward from the fortifications. Caught between these forces, the Gallic army fragmented. Those who could fled, while thousands were cut down or captured. From the heights of Alesia, Vercingetorix watched as his last hope of relief disintegrated on the plains below. The defeat was total. In a final act that would be immortalized in art and literature for centuries to come, Vercingetorix gathered his tribal council. According to Plutarch, he told them, "I did not undertake this war for private advantage, but for the common liberty. And since we must yield to fortune, I offer myself either for death or to be delivered alive to Caesar, as you shall determine." The next day, dressed in his finest armor and mounted on his war horse, Vercingetorix rode alone from Alesia's gates toward the Roman camp. He circled Caesar's tribunal once, then dismounted. In the gesture of profound symbolic meaning, he removed his weapons and ornaments of rank, placing them at the feet of his conqueror before kneeling in surrender. Caesar, ever the politician, ordered him chained and imprisoned. 6 years later, after being displayed in Caesar's triumph through the streets of Rome, Vercingetorix would be executed by strangulation, a footnote to Caesar's glory, but remembered today as one of history's noblest defenders of freedom. The dust had barely settled on the battlefield of Alesia when the ripples of its outcome began to reshape the ancient world. Caesar's victory didn't just end a siege. It transformed the map of Europe and altered the course of Western civilization for centuries to come. In the immediate aftermath, the conquest of Gaul was effectively complete. Think about the scale of this achievement. In just 8 years, Caesar had conquered a territory twice the size of Italy, home to millions of people across hundreds of tribal domains. Over 1 million Gauls had died in the fighting, with another million enslaved and sent back to Rome in chains. The wealth that flowed into Roman coffers was staggering: gold, silver, and an endless supply of slaves that would fuel the Roman economy for generations. For Caesar himself, Alesia was the crowning jewel in a campaign that catapulted him from being merely one among several powerful Roman leaders to becoming the most celebrated man in the Republic. When news of the victory reached Rome, the Senate reluctantly granted an unprecedented 20-day public thanksgiving in Caesar's honor. His commentaries on the Gallic Wars, essentially his own carefully crafted propaganda, became bestsellers among the Roman elite, cementing his reputation as a military genius. But the most fascinating aspect of Alesia's legacy was how it set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately transform Rome itself. The wealth, glory, and battle-hardened legions that Caesar gained in Gaul gave him the resources and confidence to cross the Rubicon River in 49 before Christ, igniting a civil war that would eventually replace the 500-year-old Roman Republic with an empire under his grandnephew Augustus. Did you know that without Alesia, the world might never have known the Roman Empire as we understand it today? Caesar's victory gave him the platform, popularity, and power that made his later political revolution possible. When you consider that the Roman Empire would go on to spread its language, laws, architecture, and culture throughout Europe and beyond, it's not an exaggeration to say that the siege of a single Gallic hill fort helped shape our modern world. For the conquered Gauls, the aftermath of Alesia meant profound cultural transformation. Within a generation, the Gallic aristocracy had adopted Roman dress, language, and customs. Grand Roman-style villas replaced traditional Gallic settlements. Latin gradually supplanted Celtic languages, eventually evolving into French. The Druids, with their ancient oral traditions and spiritual practices, were systematically suppressed, their sacred groves cut down, their influence diminished until their knowledge survived only in fragments and whispers. Yet the story of Gaul after Alesia isn't simply one of subjugation. In one of history's great ironies, the conquered Gauls would go on to become some of the most thoroughly Roman citizens of the empire. Gallic nobles sent their sons to be educated in Rome, served in the Roman military, and eventually even joined the Senate. By the 2nd century after Christ, emperors from Gallic backgrounds would sit on the Roman throne. The region became so prosperous under Roman rule that it was known as the Land of the Thousand Cities, with thriving urban centers connected by an extensive road network that would remain unmatched until the modern era. Vercingetorix himself became a potent symbol whose meaning would transform over time. For the Romans, he was the barbarian who had been righteously defeated by civilization. But in a remarkable historical reversal, when France emerged as a nation seeking its own identity in the 19th century, Vercingetorix was rediscovered and reimagined as France's first national hero, a unifier who had brought diverse tribes together to resist foreign domination. Emperor Napoleon III commissioned a massive 30-foot statue of Vercingetorix that still stands today at the site of Alesia, bearing the inscription, "Gaul united, forming a single nation, inspired by a common spirit, can defy the universe." The battle techniques pioneered at Alesia would influence military strategy for millennia. Caesar's innovative double-wall fortification system has been studied by military academies around the world. The concept of circumvallation, building fortifications around a besieged position, became a standard approach in siege warfare through the Middle Ages and beyond. Even today, military strategists study Alesia for lessons in resource management, battlefield engineering, and decisive leadership in crisis. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Alesia is what it teaches us about history itself, how critical moments, decisive leadership, and bold strategies can alter the trajectory of entire civilizations. In those few autumn weeks in 52 before Christ, the actions of two remarkable leaders and their armies didn't just determine who would rule Gaul. They set in motion events that would shape languages we speak, laws we follow, borders we recognize, and cultural values we inherit. Even now, more than 2,000 years later, Julius Caesar didn't merely win a battle at Alesia, he etched his name into eternity. As the sun set on that ancient battlefield over 2,000 years ago, no one could have fully grasped how those few weeks in 52 before Christ would echo through the centuries, shaping empires, languages, and cultures yet unborn. What makes Alesia so captivating isn't just the drama of the siege or the brilliant tactics employed. It's the timeless human elements that resonate across the millennia. Leadership tested to its limits, courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and the power of strategic thinking to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Caesar's victory at Alesia reminds us that history often turns on pivotal moments where preparation meets opportunity. Consider this. When Caesar built his unprecedented double fortifications, he wasn't following any military manual. No commander before him had attempted such an audacious strategy. He was innovating in real time, adapting to circumstances that would have broken lesser leaders. In our own lives and challenges, are we willing to think beyond conventional solutions when confronted with extraordinary problems? And what of Vercingetorix? Though defeated, his ability to unite the notoriously fractious Gallic tribes stands as one of history's great leadership achievements. Before him, no one had managed to bring together so many independent Celtic peoples under a single banner. Even in defeat, there is something profoundly inspiring about his stand against the world's greatest superpower. Sometimes, history remembers the noble struggle as much as the victory. There's a fascinating postscript to this epic tale that few people know. After Vercingetorix's surrender, he was kept alive as a prisoner for 6 years, a living trophy of Caesar's greatest triumph. Then in 46 before Christ, he was paraded through the streets of Rome during Caesar's grand triumph before being ritually strangled in the Tullianum prison. Yet even this wasn't truly the end. In a strange twist of historical irony, while Caesar was assassinated just 2 years later, Vercingetorix would eventually be resurrected as a national hero of France, immortalized in statues, paintings, and the French national consciousness. The Battle of Alesia teaches us that history isn't just a collection of dates and facts. It's a tapestry of human decisions, courage, failures, and triumphs that continues to inform our understanding of ourselves. When we study such pivotal moments, we're not just looking backward. We're gaining insights that remain surprisingly relevant to our modern challenges. Perhaps the most powerful lesson from Alesia is the reminder that the seemingly impossible becomes possible through a combination of vision, persistence, and adaptability. Caesar faced a numerically superior enemy, challenging terrain, and the prospect of being crushed between two massive forces. Yet through meticulous planning, innovative engineering, and decisive action at critical moments, he transformed a potential disaster into his greatest victory. As we navigate our own challenging times, what strategies might we borrow from Caesar's playbook? How might we build our own metaphorical double walls to protect against threats while pursuing our goals? And when would we be better served by Vercingetorix's courage, standing firm for what we believe in, even against overwhelming odds? Ancient history isn't dead or distant. It's a living conversation across time, offering wisdom, warnings, and inspiration for those willing to listen. The echoes of trumpets from Alesia still resonate if we only pause to hear them. Ancient history is full of epic twists and turns like this one. Comment below on which empire, battle, or historical figure you want to learn about in the next video. If you were impressed with these historical facts, share this with that friend who also loves mysteries of the past. Don't forget to subscribe to the Legacy of Empires channel, like the video, comment, and share. Until our next historical adventure, remember that understanding the past is the key to navigating our future.